it's Drybear. We're almost done with our series covering every single weapon in the First Descendant, and we're on the second to last weapon today, which I'm sorry it took me so long to do this weapon because it's actually ridiculously overpowered, and that is the tac rifle Secret Garden. So they recently buffed this weapon, and I actually was kind of taking my time because it has a couple 10% drops, which is really rough. Like, collecting this weapon is a pain in the butt. The drop percentages are really rough compared to other weapons in the game, but they raised up the crit rate and the crit damage, and the base on this weapon is actually bonkers. It is probably one of the best crit scaling weapons in the game. They raised the firearm crit rate up to 50%, and the base crit damage is 2.25, so 225% crit scaling, which is ridiculous. It has an excellent fire rate, a 4-round burst, and a really respectable amount of accuracy and recoil as well. It has one of the weirdest recoil profiles I've seen in a shooter. The way this works is, you can see, like, this is just base accuracy. You can see how accurate it is by the reticle already. It's very, very good, even on hip fire. But the recoil is super bizarre. You shoot the 4-shot burst, and the recoil applies when the burst is done, not during the recoil. So you shoot, and then your gun shoots up afterwards. It's very weird. It's almost like it's climbing a ladder as it goes up, but it's also like super easy to resist. You just gotta... You can hold the button down and just do it. But the weapon itself is insanely, insanely broken. I would put it in like the top 5 of weapons in the game right now. And it is, if you haven't been investing into it, it is definitely one to look at. Now, the other thing to look at is going to be the triggering for the passive. The passive is a part Descendant scaling ability and part weapon scaling ability. So it will give you 36% firearm attack when it's fully maxed out, and you're able to stack up 3 stacks of pest control, which does make the weapon itself better, but also gives you custom resource for the 4 characters in the game that have custom resource, and it also does give you skill power stacking up as well, which is super nice for the characters that can use it. And just for reference, here are all the characters that can interact with the passive that exists on this, right? So part of the passive gives you custom resource. Currently, only 4 Descendants have custom resource. Ajax, Bunny, Glay, and Kyle are the only ones that can benefit from this effect. And also, you stack the custom resource by triggering a dimension skill, which I don't know if anyone thought this through, but the only characters that have dimension scales right now is Ajax, Glay, and Kyle, which means that Bunny can activate the dimension passive, or she can activate it, but she can benefit from the custom resource recovery, but she can't activate it. She has no way to activate it because she doesn't have a dimension skill. So super weird, but Ajax, Glay, and Kyle can get custom resource back if they use this weapon and they use their dimension skills. The second half of the passive that gives you skill power stacking as well as firearm attack stacking, can be triggered by Viessa, Freyna, Ajax, Lepic, Luna, Kyle, and Essima, which you'll see on the sheet that I'll show later. So these characters can trigger the firearm attack and skill power scaling on the passive. If you're not one of these characters, you won't be able to interact with the passive, but the default gun is pretty great. If you don't activate the passive at all, the default DPS for the weapon is 920,000 DPS, which is still puts it up in the highest echelon of the game. It's not like broken, but anything between 900 to 1,000,000 is still one of the best, but not the best. Like, not broken, not overpowered, just very, very good. So even if you don't activate the passive, the weapon is still worth using. So I'm going to give you 2 different builds to look at today, because they want the best build, the prime build. If you've seen my videos before, you know prime builds require very high accuracy. Like, they are these sweaty, you have to be paying attention and trying really hard to use it. And it's also a build, like any of the prime high accuracy builds may not be a best bet if you're playing on console where the auto aim isn't super perfect. So we'll start with the best basic build, which isn't like the best uptime, like the best like throughput amount of damage, but it's still very good damage and doesn't require you to have excellent accuracy on weak point to benefit from it. In this case, we're going to run mental focus because the tactical rifles are technically semi-automatic. They are burst fire, but they have semi-automatic fire. You can turn on a setting in the game that is in the options menu that allows you to simulate full automatic, but it's not actually full automatic, which means we can't trigger sharp precision shot. Sharp precision shot would actually be a very high weighted module for this weapon. It just can't stack it because it's technically not fully automatic. So our options here are going to be mental focus, real life fighter, sweeping squad, and elemental conductor. For the most part, there's not really any other ultimates that really make the list on making this weapon shine. So we're going to mental focus, action and reaction, rifling reinforcement, and of course elemental enhancement for weakness. Again, this module scales incredibly well because it scales off a firearm attack, Elemental damage by default is very good, but it's even better when it scales off your firearm attack. And then since we have amazing crit chance and crit damage, we're going to run better concentration and better insight and fatal critical and insight focus. We don't get to see insight focus make its way into a build too often unless you're running like supply moisture or an Enzo buff uptime of like really high, like almost 24/7 you have the buff. We don't get to see insight focus as often, but this is on base without descendant buffs. It makes the list. Insight focus, not that often. Super cool to see it. So that's really cool. Then we run fire rate up and reload focus. Reload focus, giving that extra crit on it. And the reload on this weapon is already very good, but getting even more reload on it makes it even better, especially when we have mental focus, where we want to just get back into stacking those as fast as possible. So this is the basic build. Your stat priority is going to be firearm attack, flat elemental damage from firearm attack. Currently, the only source in the game from that is elemental enhancement versus weakness. Crit damage, then crit chance, fire rate, weak point, then reload and rounds. This weapon by itself already has amazing scaling across the board. For reroll priority, I would recommend trying to get bonus versus Colossi, then crit damage, flat elemental damage, and then firearm attack is your best four. But you can also work in crit chance if you don't get lucky enough to get a gold rolled on one of these others. Crit chance is also still quite good on the weapon, though not as good as these others, as you can see by the weighting right above my head. For the Enhance and Catalyst priority, because I know I still get questions on this, I'm going to review it again when I do my tier list, but in general, what you're seeing down here in the bottom right is the optimal DPS output build. But it may not be the most comfortable or enjoyable. It's optimized for DPS and may come with some downsides. So if you want to swap out any of these mods, you want more accuracy, you want less recoil, you want movement speed, you want whatever it is you want to swap, you want to use a different mod, that's fine. That's why I include the weightings here on the left side of the screen. So you would just go and find the lowest on the list here, which would be reload focus at 13%. And if you want to swap that out for something else, you're not going to lose as much as these other mods here. These are in order of how much power they provide. So you can swap this out for something else if you wanted to have something else, or maybe both of these. Anything on the far right side here is going to be the lowest weighting value overall, and that way you can compare it to other mods here on the left. I've also on this image put little tiny heads of the characters that do have tech skills, so you can actually stack the passive for the 36% firearm attack and also trigger the skill damage as well, which is nice, which is these 7 characters listed here. And now let's go through the prime build, which is the high accuracy requirement, but the DPS goes up substantially. So with the prime builds, we run Real Life Fighter, and Real Life Fighter is one of the best mods in the game if you can stack it consistently. It requires, this one isn't as bad as some of the other prime builds like Python or Nazastra's Devotion, which have prime builds. You can probably sit at around 60% to 70% weak point accuracy, but still very high weak point accuracy here. And that's when we're going to stack Real Life Fighter. And the great thing about Real Life Fighter is it lasts between reloads, which means you're not constantly going up and down in power unless you're missing. So if you're hitting consistently, you can get a lot of damage out of this. And the damage weightings on some of these stats swing quite a bit towards different options because we're going to be doing a little bit more with that. So same characters for tech skills, stacking up that firearm attack passive, Real Life Fighter, action and reaction, rifling reinforcement, better concentration and better insight, and then fatal critical. We're not going to run insight focus here because we scale much better with weak point if you're being more consistent on that. Fire rate up, elemental enhancement. With this, you'll notice from the last page, elemental damage came down because we're focusing a lot on weak point, and we know that weak point only affects some elemental damage, not every elemental damage that procs. So in the case here, that's why some of the numbers change, is that weak point isn't going to make these elemental procs from an enhancement better, and so that loses some of its weighting value and moves down the list, but still is a very large increase on that. And then of course we're going to have aiming compensation and weak point sight. The main reason here is that because it is a burst rifle with a very chunky recoil, missing shots can be very painful, and so for that reason I think I want to go aiming compensation on this. This gives you a little bit more accuracy on that, which is really useful. So on that point, so like if you get these kind of like really like, because it's Real Life Fighter, if you end up shooting up and you shoot and you miss a single burst, that's 4 shots you'll miss. You'll end up losing 8 stacks of Real Life Fighter. So I think in this case, even in the best scenario, you probably do need aiming compensation, which is fine. It'll max it out. It'll overcome the down accuracy that you'll get from Real Life Fighter and put that together. But again, if you wanted to, you could swap out weak point sight for either like a stabilization, like vibration absorption, or stabilization for one of the purple mods for down recoil, or you could replace weak point sight with Hawkeye if you wanted wanted a little bit more accuracy on that to make sure you're hitting it. But this requires you to hit a weak point with basically the majority of your shots. You get a very nice DPS increase and your stat weightings will change, but it is also much harder. And because it's a burst fire weapon with like very janky jawtooth recoil, it's possible this isn't a very viable build on console unless you're a god or you get very, very close to the target, right? It could be that you use this on Colossi that have big parts that you can shoot, but maybe on commanders and elites, it might be a little less viable. So I provide both those options here because I know some people don't like these prime builds. And anytime we do a prime build, I always offer an alternative in case you don't want to fiend after weak point like you're some starving person in the desert that hasn't had water. So you have your mental focus option, which is still very good. The DPS here is insanely high for a mental focus build, if nothing else. And you'll still be outperforming almost every single weapon in the game, even if you don't go for the real-life fighter variant, which is going to give you more DPS overall. But this weapon is crazy. I will, reaffirmed that you want to try and activate the passive by using tech skills with these 7 Descendants, but it's not necessary. You'll just have a little bit less here. You'll be down into like the 900k to 1 million DPS if you don't get this passive active and sustain it as well. But that is the secret garden. There's a lot of options here of this weapon, and the base stats are ridiculous. It's a super fun weapon too. 4-shot burst is very cool if you line it up, and the base, the base pattern and base accuracy make it a very cozy weapon to use as well. So this is the secret garden. So this is the second to last weapon. We got one more weapon to go, and we've done them all. Let's go. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.